The rain fell in sheets across the Yorkshire moors, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Oliver Hartley's small fingers clutched his mother's hand tighter as they trudged forward, her grip growing weaker with each step. Margaret Hartley's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest burning with each inhale. The fever had been building for days, weeks really, but she'd ignored it, pushed through it, worked through it. The rent was due. Oliver needed new shoes. Winter was coming. There was no time for illness. No money for doctors. No luxury of rest. "Mama!" Oliver's voice trembled as he looked up at her pale face. Even at 6 years old, he could see something was terribly wrong. His mother's usually bright eyes were glazed, her cheeks flushed with fever despite the cold rain soaking through their threadbare clothes. "Just a bit further, my love," Margaret whispered, though she wasn't sure where they were going anymore. The world spun around her. The lights of Thornfield Manor glowed in the distance like a beacon, but they might as well have been stars. Beautiful, unreachable, belonging to a world so far above her own that she'd never dared to look directly at them. Her vision blurred. The road tilted beneath her feet. "Mama!" Oliver cried out as Margaret's knees buckled. She tried to catch herself, tried to stay upright for her son, but her body had finally reached its limit. 3 weeks of working from dawn until midnight, skipping meals so Oliver could eat, sleeping only a few hours each night, all while pneumonia quietly ravaged her lungs. Her pride had kept her going. Her love for Oliver had pushed her beyond human endurance. But even love couldn't defy the body's ultimate surrender. Margaret collapsed onto the muddy road, the cold rain beating down on her motionless form. "Mama, Mama, please!" Oliver dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulders with his small hands. "Wake up! Please wake up!" His voice cracked with terror as he patted her cheeks, tried to lift her head, begged her to open her eyes. But Margaret remained still, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin burning with fever even as the October rain chilled her to the bone. Oliver looked around desperately. The road was empty. The fields stretched endlessly in every direction. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping. His mother needed help now, or she would die here in the mud. He knew it with the certain instinct of a child who'd already lost one parent and couldn't bear to lose another. Through the rain, he saw them again, those lights. Thornfield Manor, the Duke's mansion. His mother had pointed it out once, explaining in hushed tones that very important people lived there, people so far above them that Oliver should never even think of approaching the gates. "It's not for the likes of us," she'd said gently. "We have our place, and they have theirs." But his mother was dying. Let's continue the story. But before that, subscribe and leave a like. Help this channel grow and touch more lives. Oliver looked back at Margaret's pale face, then at the distant lights of the mansion. Fear warred with desperation in his small chest. What would they do to a poor boy who dared approach a duke's door? Would they send him away? Call the constable? His mother's words echoed in his mind. Not for the likes of us. But louder still was the sound of her labored breathing, growing fainter by the second. The decision crystallized in an instant. Oliver bent down and kissed his mother's cold forehead. "I'll be right back, Mama, I promise." Then he turned and ran. His legs pumped as fast as they could carry him, his worn shoes splashing through puddles, mud spattering up his thin trousers. The rain stung his face and blurred his vision, but he didn't slow down. The gates of Thornfield Manor loomed ahead, massive iron structures that seemed designed to keep out exactly the kind of boy he was. But Oliver didn't hesitate. He squeezed through the bars and ran up the long gravel drive, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The manor was even more imposing up close, 3 stories of grey stone with dozens of windows glowing with warm gaslight. Manicured gardens flanked the entrance, and a fountain stood silent in the centre of the circular drive. Oliver had never seen anything so grand, so far removed from his world of cramped cottages and constant struggle. For a moment his courage faltered. Then he remembered his mother lying in the rain. Oliver ran up the stone steps and began pounding on the massive oak door with both fists. "Help!" he screamed, his voice high and desperate. "Please, somebody help! My mother! She won't wake up! Please!" He beat on the door until his small hands ached, crying now, terror overwhelming him. "Please, please, she's going to die! Help!" Inside the manor, Henry Morrison, the head butler, heard the commotion with deep displeasure. Who would dare approach the Duke's door in such a manner? He moved toward the entrance with every intention of sending away whatever tradesman or beggar had the audacity to disturb His Grace's evening. But before Henry reached the door, Another figure appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Ravenswood, paused on the landing, his attention caught by the desperate screams outside. He was dressed for dinner in a perfectly tailored black evening coat, his dark hair slightly silver at the temples, his expression one of habitual control. At 35, Nathaniel had perfected the art of aristocratic detachment. 5 years of widowhood had only reinforced the walls he'd built around his heart. He ran his estates with efficiency, raised his daughter with appropriate guidance from hired staff, and maintained his position in society with flawless propriety. He felt nothing deeply anymore. It was safer that way. But something in that child's scream pierced through his carefully maintained armor. "Henry, wait!" Nathaniel commanded, descending the stairs quickly. The butler stepped aside as the Duke himself opened the door. The sight that greeted him was wholly unexpected. A small boy stood on his doorstep, absolutely soaked through, shivering violently, his face streaked with tears and mud. The child's eyes were wild with fear, and the moment the door opened, he lunged forward, grabbing the Duke's coat with muddy hands. "Please, sir, please, you have to help," Oliver sobbed, barely able to get the words out. "My mother, she collapsed on the road. She won't wake up. She's so cold in the rain. Please, sir, please, she's all I have. Don't let her die." Nathaniel stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring down at this desperate child who clung to him with such raw need. Something shifted in his chest. A feeling he'd thought long dead stirred to life. He saw himself reflected in the boy's terror, remembered standing helpless as his own wife slipped away, remembered the crushing weight of impotent grief. "Where is she?" Nathaniel asked, his voice sharp with sudden command. "On the road, sir. Just past the gates. Please hurry." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Henry, fetch Dr. Whitmore immediately. Tell him it's urgent. Mrs. Pemberton," he called to his housekeeper. "Prepare the blue guest room, fire, hot water, extra blankets, now." He grabbed his coat from the rack and turned back to Oliver. "Show me." They ran together through the rain, the Duke of Ravenswood and the poor boy, all social barriers momentarily forgotten in the face of human crisis. Oliver led him down the drive and out through the gates. There, crumpled in the mud barely 200 meters from the estate entrance, lay Margaret Hartley. Nathaniel dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his fingers to her throat. Her pulse was there but weak and rapid, her skin burned with fever. She was unconscious, her lips slightly blue, her breathing frighteningly shallow. Pneumonia, almost certainly. Advanced pneumonia. Without a word, Nathaniel gathered Margaret into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She was terrifyingly light, evidence of how little she'd been eating, how hard she'd been working. Her head lolled against his chest, rain streaming down her pale face. Is she dead?" Oliver whispered, his voice breaking. "No," Nathaniel said firmly, "and we're going to keep it that way. Come." He strode back toward the manor, Oliver running alongside him, the boy's small hand gripping the Duke's coat as though afraid to let go of his only hope. The household was in chaos when they arrived. Mrs. Pemberton, the formidable housekeeper who'd served the family for 30 years, stood in the entrance hall with her mouth agape as the Duke carried a muddy, unconscious woman through the front door. "Your Grace, you cannot possibly—" A woman of her station in the guest quarters. "That will be quite enough, Mrs. Pemberton," Nathaniel said coldly, not breaking stride. "This woman is gravely ill and will be treated with every care this household can provide. Prepare the room as I ordered." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line, but she obeyed, leading the way up the grand staircase. Behind them, servants whispered and stared. A poor woman, obviously a laborer by her rough clothing, being carried by the Duke himself. It was unprecedented, scandalous. What could his Grace be thinking? Nathaniel was thinking only of the woman's labored breathing and the terrified child at his heels. The blue guest room was one of the finest in the manor. Silk wallpaper, mahogany furniture, a 4-poster bed with velvet hangings. A fire already crackled in the marble fireplace. Nathaniel laid Margaret gently on the bed, heedless of the mud staining the fine linens. "Remove her wet clothes and get her into something dry and warm," he instructed Mrs. Pemberton. "Carefully, she's burning with fever. Your Grace, surely a maid should—" "I don't care who does it, but do it quickly. Where is Dr. Whitmore?" "Henry sent for him, Your Grace. He should arrive within the hour. An hour might be too long." Nathaniel looked down at Margaret's pale face, feeling helpless anger rise in his chest. How had someone so young come to this state? Where was her family? Her husband? He noticed no wedding ring on her bare, work-roughened hand. A widow, then, working herself to death to survive, to care for her son. Oliver crept closer to the bed, his teeth chattering from cold and shock. He reached out tentatively to touch his mother's hand. "Mama," he whispered, "we're somewhere safe now. You can wake up." Nathaniel's throat tightened. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "What's your name, son?" "Oh, Oliver, sir. Oliver Hartley. And that's my mama, Margaret Hartley. Mrs. Margaret Hartley. She's a widow, sir. My papa died 2 years ago." "I see." Nathaniel knelt beside the boy so they were eye to eye. Up close he could see that beneath the mud and tears, Oliver had his mother's fine features, the same determined chin, the same grey-blue eyes. "Oliver, your mother is very sick, but Dr. Whitmore is the best physician in Yorkshire, and we're going to do everything we can to help her. Do you understand?" Oliver nodded, blinking back fresh tears. "I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't. I didn't know what else to do." "You did exactly right," Nathaniel said firmly. "You were very brave to come here for help. That took tremendous courage. Mama always says we shouldn't bother important people. She says we have our place." Oliver's lower lip trembled. "But I didn't know what else to do." Nathaniel felt something crack inside his chest. "Your place," he said quietly, "is beside your mother, and right now that place is here." He stood and called for a maid. "Sarah, draw a hot bath for the boy and find some appropriate clothing. He's frozen through." "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton protested, "we cannot possibly—" "We can and we will," Nathaniel said with icy finality. "This child will be treated as a guest of this house for as long as necessary. Is that understood?" The housekeeper's face flushed with disapproval, but she nodded stiffly. "As you wish, Your Grace." Oliver looked up at Nathaniel with something like awe. No one in his young life had ever spoken of him as deserving of care or consideration. He was just a poor boy, an extra mouth to feed, a burden. But this great man, this duke, was treating him like he mattered. "I don't want to leave, Mama," Oliver said softly. "You won't have to go far. There's a room adjoining this one. You can stay there and check on her whenever you need to. But first you need to get warm and dry or you'll get sick too. And your mother will need you healthy when she wakes up, won't she?" Oliver considered this logic and nodded reluctantly. "When she wakes up?" "Not if. When," Nathaniel confirmed, though privately he wasn't at all certain. The woman looked desperately ill. Sarah, a young housemaid with a kind face, appeared and held out her hand to Oliver. "Come with me, love. Let's get you sorted out." Oliver took one last look at his mother, then allowed himself to be led away. The moment the door closed behind them, Mrs. Pemberton rounded on Nathaniel. "Your Grace, I must speak plainly. This is highly irregular. A woman of unknown origins, in one of our finest guest rooms. What will people say?" "I don't particularly care what people say, Mrs. Pemberton. But, Your Grace, there are proprieties to consider. Lady Isabella's reputation—" "My daughter's reputation will be just fine. This is a humanitarian matter, nothing more." Nathaniel turned to look at Margaret's still form. This woman is someone's daughter, someone's mother. She's a widow who has clearly been working herself to death to provide for her child. What would you have had me do? Leave her in the rain to die? Mrs. Pemberton had no answer for that. Dr. James Whitmore arrived 40 minutes later, his medical bag in hand, and his expression grave. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and keen eyes that missed nothing. He'd delivered Isabella into the world 5 years ago and been present when Victoria, Nathaniel's wife, had slipped away in the same bed. He'd seen the Duke through the darkest period of his life and was one of the few people Nathaniel truly trusted. "Show me the patient," Whitmore said without preamble. Nathaniel led him to the blue guest room, where Margaret lay cleaned and dressed in one of the manor's nightgowns, her damp hair spread across the pillow. Her breathing was audible now, a rasping, rattling sound that made both men wince. Whitmore conducted a thorough examination, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. He listened to her lungs, checked her pulse and temperature, examined her throat and eyes. Finally, he straightened and gestured for Nathaniel to follow him into the hallway. "Well?" Nathaniel demanded. "Pneumonia. Severe case. Her lungs are badly congested." Whitmore shook his head. "I'd say she's been ill for weeks but continued working regardless. Classic case of someone choosing between medicine and food, between rest and rent. She chose survival for her child over care for herself, and now she's paying the price." "Will she live?" Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, Nathaniel, I don't know. The next 24 hours will be critical. If the fever breaks, she has a chance. If it continues to rise—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "What can we do?" "Keep her warm but not overheated. Cool compresses for the fever. Try to get fluids into her when she's conscious enough to swallow. I'll leave laudanum for the pain and some expectorant for the congestion. But mostly, Nathaniel, she needs time, rest and care. Things I suspect she hasn't had in a very long time. She'll have them now, Nathaniel said firmly. Whitmore studied his old friend with interest. You've taken quite an interest in this woman. I've taken an interest in seeing that she doesn't die under my roof, leaving her child an orphan. Of course. Whitmore's tone suggested he saw more than Nathaniel was saying, but he let it pass. I'll return tomorrow morning to check on her. Send for me immediately if her condition worsens. He paused at the top of the stairs. Nathaniel, what you're doing, caring for this woman and her child, it's a good thing, a human thing, so I'm glad to see it. After the doctor left, Nathaniel returned to Margaret's room. Mrs. Pemberton had stationed herself in a chair by the fire, clearly intending to serve as a chaperone and maintain some semblance of propriety. Nathaniel didn't argue. He took a seat on the opposite side of the bed and settled in to wait. The night stretched long. Margaret's fever raged, making her toss and turn, cry out in delirium. She called for Oliver, for someone named Thomas, her late husband, Nathaniel assumed. She begged for more time, pleaded for work, apologized for being weak. Each desperate utterance painted a picture of a life lived on the knife's edge of survival, where one misstep, one illness, meant disaster. Nathaniel found himself growing angry, not at Margaret, but at a world that ground people like her into dust. She was clearly educated. Her speech, even in delirium, was articulate. She was respectable, hard-working, devoted to her child, and yet circumstance had left her with no safety net, no support, nothing between her and death but her own stubborn will to survive. Near midnight, Oliver appeared in the doorway, scrubbed clean and dressed in a nightshirt several sizes too large. He'd clearly been unable to sleep. How is she? He asked quietly. The same, Nathaniel said. Come here. Oliver approached the bed and took his mother's hand. I'm here, Mama, he whispered. You're safe now, you can rest. As if hearing him, Margaret's restless movement stilled slightly. Her breathing remained labored, but some of the agitation left her face. She hears you, Nathaniel said. She always hears me, Oliver replied with simple faith, even when she's asleep. She says mothers always know where their children are, even in their dreams. Nathaniel thought of Isabella, asleep in the nursery wing, cared for by servants who were competent but not loving. When had he last tucked her in? When had he last sat with her, just talking, just being present? His own daughter was growing up in the same house, yet they were strangers to each other. This boy, who had nothing but his mother, had more real love than Isabella with all her privilege. The thought was deeply uncomfortable. You should sleep, Nathaniel told Oliver. Your mother needs you healthy. Will you stay with her? Oliver asked. I don't want her to be alone. I'll stay, Nathaniel promised. Oliver nodded, satisfied, and reluctantly returned to the adjoining room. Mrs. Pemberton had dozed off in her chair, snoring softly. Nathaniel was left alone with his thoughts and the sound of Margaret's labored breathing. As dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors, Margaret's fever finally spiked to its crisis point. She convulsed, crying out, her skin burning to the touch. Nathaniel acted on instinct, calling for cold water and cloths. He gently bathed her face, her throat, her arms, trying to bring down the fever. Mrs. Pemberton woke and helped, her disapproval temporarily set aside in the face of medical emergency. Come on, Nathaniel found himself whispering. Fight. Your son needs you. Don't give up. Just as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, glassy with fever, but open. She looked around in confusion, then her gaze landed on Nathaniel's face. Oliver, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's safe, Nathaniel assured her. He's sleeping in the next room. He's perfectly safe. Thank you, Margaret breathed, and then her eyes closed again. But this time, her breathing was easier. The fever had broken. Nathaniel slumped back in his chair, exhausted but profoundly relieved. She would live. Against the odds, she would live. When Dr. Whitmore returned that morning, he found Nathaniel still sitting vigil, dark circles under his eyes, but a slight smile on his face. The fever broke at dawn, Nathaniel reported. Whitmore examined Margaret and nodded with satisfaction. She's through the worst of it. Now she needs time to recover her strength. Several weeks, I'd say. She's severely malnourished and exhausted beyond measure, but with proper care and nutrition, she should make a full recovery. She'll have it, Nathaniel said firmly. Whatever she needs for as long as she needs it. Mrs. Pemberton opened her mouth to protest, then thought better of it. There was something in the Duke's expression that brooked no argument. The household adapted to its unexpected guests over the following days. Oliver, after a good night's sleep and several hearty meals, proved to be a bright, polite, and remarkably resilient child. He spent his days reading in the library, marveling at having so many books available, and sitting with his mother, talking to her even when she couldn't respond. On the third day, Margaret fully regained consciousness. Her first sight upon waking was Oliver asleep in a chair beside her bed, his small hand clutching hers. The second sight was the opulent room around her, silk wallpaper, fine furniture, a crackling fire. Confusion gave way to horror as she realized where she must be. She tried to sit up, gasping at the weakness in her limbs. The movement woke Oliver, who nearly fell out of his chair in joy. "Mama, you're awake! You're really awake!" He threw himself at her, hugging her carefully. "Oliver," Margaret managed, her voice hoarse. Where are we?" "The Duke's house, Mama. Thornfield Manor. I got help, just like you would have wanted me to. The Duke himself carried you here, and the doctor came, and they saved you." Margaret's eyes widened in dismay. "Oliver, no, we can't, we shouldn't." She looked around wildly. "We must leave immediately. This isn't proper. We don't belong." "You're not going anywhere," a deep voice said from the doorway. Margaret's head snapped toward the sound. There stood a man in his mid-30s, tall and commanding, with dark hair touched with silver and eyes of startling intensity. He was dressed impeccably in the afternoon clothing of a gentleman, but there was something in his bearing, an air of absolute authority, that marked him unmistakably as nobility. The Duke of Ravenswood himself. Margaret tried to struggle upright, to show proper deference, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak even to sit up properly. Shame and panic flooded through her. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion. We'll leave at once. I never meant to impose—" "Mrs. Hartley?" Nathaniel said, moving into the room and taking a seat in the chair Oliver had vacated. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were gravely ill. You nearly died. Your son showed remarkable courage in seeking help. But we don't belong here," Margaret whispered, tears of humiliation filling her eyes. I'm just a washerwoman, Your Grace. This room, this care, it's far more than I deserve or can ever repay." "You nearly left your son an orphan out of pride," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "Is that what you wanted?" Margaret flinched as if struck. "No," she breathed. "Then allow yourself to be cared for. You need several weeks to recover fully. Dr. Whitmore has been quite clear on that point. You're severely malnourished and exhausted. If you leave now, you'll likely relapse within days." "I can't pay for this," Margaret said desperately. "The doctor's fees, the room, the food, I have nothing, less than nothing. I'm not asking for payment. Then you're asking me to accept charity, and I cannot. I won't." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Even weakened, there was a fierce dignity about her, a pride that refused to bend despite her circumstances. He understood pride. He'd built his life around maintaining his own. But he also saw the foolishness of it, the way it had nearly killed her. "Then consider it a debt to your son," he said quietly. "Oliver saved your life by asking for help. He overcame his fear of approaching someone far above his station because he loved you more than he feared rejection or humiliation. He put aside pride for your sake. Can you not do the same for his?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Oliver, who gazed back at her with such open love and relief that her heart broke. He'd been so brave, so frightened, and she'd nearly left him alone in the world because she was too stubborn to admit she needed help, to see a doctor, to rest when her body was failing. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her son. "I'm so sorry I scared you." Oliver crawled onto the bed beside her, careful of her fragile state. "You didn't do anything wrong, Mama. You were sick. But you're going to get better now, the Duke promised." Margaret looked at Nathaniel over Oliver's head. "Did you?" "I did," Nathaniel confirmed. "And I keep my promises, Mrs. Hartley." There was something in his gaze, an intensity, a connection that made Margaret's breath catch. For just a moment the barriers of class and circumstance fell away, and they were simply two people who'd both known loss, both understood the weight of survival, both carried scars invisible to the outside world. Then Mrs. Pemberton entered with a tea tray, and the moment passed. "You should eat," Nathaniel said, standing. "Build your strength. We can discuss the future when you're well enough to think clearly." He left before Margaret could protest further. Mrs. Pemberton set down the tray with an expression that suggested she found the entire situation deeply improper, but was too well trained to say so directly. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. The housekeeper sniffed. "Don't thank me. Thank His Grace. He's the one who's turned this household upside down for you." After she left, Oliver helped his mother sit up against the pillows. "The Duke is nice, Mama. Different from what I expected. He talks to me like I'm a real person, not just a poor boy." Margaret stroked his hair, her heart aching. In Oliver's short life, being treated with basic human dignity was remarkable enough to comment upon. What kind of world did they live in? She looked around the beautiful room, felt the softness of the bed, smelled the fragrant tea. For the first time in 2 years, perhaps longer, she was warm, comfortable, safe. It terrified her, because she knew this couldn't last. This was borrowed time, borrowed comfort. Soon she'd have to return to her real life, and the contrast would be crushing. But for now, with Oliver nestled beside her and hot tea warming her hands, Margaret allowed herself to simply be grateful. Downstairs, Nathaniel stood in his study, staring out at the rainy grounds. He should be attending to estate business, reviewing accounts, meeting with his land agent. Instead, he found his thoughts circling back to the woman upstairs. There was something about Margaret Hartley that unsettled him. Her fierce dignity, her obvious love for her son, the way she'd worked herself to the brink of death rather than accept help. It spoke of a strength of character he rarely encountered, even among his own class. She'd suffered, struggled, and yet maintained her integrity. How many people could say the same? And then there was the boy. Oliver's courage, his devotion to his mother, his surprising poise despite his circumstances. In 3 days, the child had somehow worked his way into Nathaniel's carefully guarded heart. He thought of Isabella, so close in age to Oliver, yet living in an entirely different world. When had he last really talked to his daughter? When had he last held her, comforted her, made her feel seen and loved rather than simply cared for? His wife Victoria had been dead for 5 years. For 5 years he'd told himself he was protecting Isabella by maintaining distance, by not risking the pain of deep attachment again. But looking at Oliver and Margaret, he realized he'd been protecting himself, not his daughter. And in doing so, he'd left Isabella as lonely as he was. The rain continued to fall, but inside Thornfield Manor, something was beginning to shift. Ice that had formed around hearts was starting, very slowly, to thaw. Recovery came slowly, measured in small victories. On the 4th day, Margaret was able to sit up without assistance. On the 5th, she ate a full meal. By the end of the 1st week, she could walk across the room, though the effort left her breathless and shaking. Oliver was her constant companion, reading to her from the manor's extensive library, fairy tales mostly, though occasionally he'd choose something more ambitious and stumble through the difficult words with endearing determination. Margaret would help him sound out the harder passages, turning each visit into an impromptu lesson. Education had been the one gift her father had given her before he'd lost everything to debt, and it was the one gift she was determined to pass to Oliver, even if she could give him nothing else. Nathaniel found reasons to visit more often than strictly necessary. He'd bring new books he thought Oliver might enjoy, inquire about Margaret's progress, stay for brief conversations that somehow stretched longer each time. He told himself he was simply being a responsible host, ensuring his guests were well cared for. He didn't examine too closely why his day felt more complete after these visits, or why he found himself listening for Margaret's voice in the hallways. Mrs. Pemberton watched these developments with increasing disapproval, but held her tongue. In 30 years of service, she'd never seen the Duke show such interest in anyone outside his immediate circle. It worried her. Nothing good could come of a Duke becoming attached to a penniless widow, no matter how respectable she seemed. On the 8th day, Margaret insisted on getting out of bed and dressing in her own clothes, which had been laundered and mended by the household staff. She needed to feel like herself again, not like some fine lady playing dress-up in borrowed nightgowns. The simple cotton dress was worn but clean, patched but respectable. It reminded her who she was. She was standing by the window, looking out at the grounds she could never have imagined being inside a week ago, when Nathaniel knocked and entered. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, then paused, taking in the change. "You're up." "I can't stay in bed forever, Your Grace," Margaret said, keeping her eyes on the garden rather than meeting his gaze. It was easier that way. "I need to start thinking about returning to my life." "You're not strong enough yet." "I'm strong enough to stand." "That's a start." She turned to face him, clasping her hands in front of her to hide their trembling. "Your Grace, I need to speak plainly about my situation. The longer I stay here, the worse it becomes." "Worse? You're recovering. How is that worse?" "Because every day I'm not working is a day I'm not earning. My rent is already late. My landlord isn't a patient man. By now he's likely rented my cottage to someone else. My few possessions are probably gone. And without a home I can't take in washing or mending. Without work I can't feed Oliver or find us lodging. Her voice remained steady despite the panic underlying her words. I need to leave while I still have some options, before I'm so far behind that recovery becomes impossible. Nathaniel felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at the system that placed people in such precarious positions. What if I paid your rent? No. The word was sharp, definitive. Why not? Consider it payment for what? Margaret interrupted, her eyes flashing. For the privilege of watching me nearly die. For my son's terror. Your Grace, I will not become an object of your charity. I have nothing left but my dignity, and I will not surrender that too. Is dignity worth dying for? Sometimes, yes. Margaret lifted her chin. You wouldn't understand. You've never had to choose between pride and survival. Never had to weigh the cost of asking for help against the cost of accepting it. In your world, people's respect comes with your title. In mine, respect is all we have, and once lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. Nathaniel studied her, this fierce woman who'd almost worked herself to death rather than accept charity. Part of him wanted to argue, to point out the foolishness of her pride. But another part, a growing part, admired her tremendously. In a society built on deference and obligation, here was someone who refused to bow, who insisted on her own worth, even when the world told her she had none. What if I offered you employment? He said. Margaret blinked. Employment? Yes. Honest work, for honest wages. Would your pride allow that? What kind of employment? Suspicion crept into her voice. Your Grace, I won't be a governess, Nathaniel said quickly, understanding her fear. For my daughter, Isabella. She's 5 years old, and while she has tutors for the academic subjects, she needs someone to provide warmth, guidance, the kind of care a mother would give. His voice softened. The kind I see you give Oliver every day. Margaret stared at him, caught between hope and disbelief. Your Grace, I'm not qualified to be a governess. I have no references, no formal training. You're educated. That's clear from your speech, your manner, and more importantly, you understand how to love a child, how to make them feel valued and seen. That's something no amount of formal training can teach. He paused, then added honestly, Isabella has everything a child could want materially, but she's lonely, Mrs. Hartley, desperately lonely, and I don't know how to fix that. The admission cost him something, Margaret could see. This proud duke, confessing his failure as a father to a woman far beneath his station. It made him human in a way that touched her more than all his previous kindness. May I think about it? She asked quietly. Of course. But Mrs. Hartley, Oliver told me something the other day. He said you always teach him to ask for help when he needs it, but you never do the same. Perhaps it's time you practiced what you preach. After he left, Margaret sank into the chair, her mind whirling. A position at Thornfield Manor, regular wages, stability for Oliver, but also proximity to a man who made her feel things she had no business feeling, in a world where she would never truly belong. She was still wrestling with the decision when Oliver burst into the room, breathless with excitement. Mama, you have to come see. There's another child here, a girl. She's my age, and she saw me in the garden, and she said hello. A real lady said hello to me. Margaret's heart clenched. Oliver, you shouldn't be bothering the Duke's daughter. I wasn't bothering her. She wanted to talk to me. She asked about my book and everything. Oliver grabbed his mother's hand. Can I show you? Please? Unable to refuse his excitement, Margaret allowed herself to be led downstairs and out into the garden. There, near a small fountain, sat a little girl in a fine blue dress, her dark hair pulled back with ribbons. She was alone, a book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was watching Oliver approach with undisguised interest. This is my mamma, Oliver announced proudly. Mamma, this is Lady Isabella. The little girl stood and executed a perfect curtsy. How do you do, Mrs. Hartley? I'm very glad you're feeling better. Papa said you were very ill. Up close, Margaret could see the loneliness in those young eyes, the careful manners that seemed learned rather than natural. This was a child who'd been taught how to behave but not how to play, who knew protocol but not spontaneity. I'm much better, thank you, Lady Isabella. It's very kind of you to ask. Oliver told me about all the books you've been reading together, Isabella continued, a wistful note in her voice. It sounds lovely. My governess reads to me too, but she always falls asleep before the story ends. Oliver, with the bluntness of childhood, said, That sounds boring. Mamma never falls asleep. And she does all the voices different so you can tell who's talking. Isabella's eyes widened. Really? Could you, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, could you show me? Margaret found herself sitting on the garden bench with a child on either side, reading from Isabella's book, a rather dry moral tale about the virtues of obedience. But Margaret didn't just read, she performed, giving each character a distinct voice, adding dramatic pauses, making the children giggle at her exaggerated expressions. When she finished the first chapter, Isabella was leaning against her side, looking up at her with something like wonder. "You make it so much more interesting," she breathed. "Could we read another chapter, please?" "I think that's enough for today, Isabella." All three of them startled. Nathaniel stood a few meters away, and Margaret couldn't quite read his expression. She stood quickly, pulling Oliver with her. "Your Grace, I apologize. I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't." Nathaniel's gaze moved from his daughter's animated face to Margaret's concerned one. "I haven't seen Isabella this engaged in months. Years, perhaps." He stepped closer. "Have you considered my offer, Mrs. Hartley?" Margaret looked at Isabella, who gazed back at her with such hope that it made her chest ache. She thought of Oliver, who deserved stability and safety. She thought of herself, exhausted from years of struggling alone. Sometimes pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Yes," she said softly. "I accept, Your Grace. I'll be your daughter's governess." Isabella let out a small squeal of delight and immediately grabbed Margaret's hand. "Does that mean you'll stay? You and Oliver both?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice catching slightly. "We'll stay." Oliver hugged his mother tight, and over his head, Margaret's eyes met Nathaniel's. There was something in that look, gratitude, recognition, and something else, something neither of them was ready to name. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the clouds. And at Thornfield Manor, three lonely people, a widow, a duke, and his daughter, were taking the first tentative steps toward becoming something that looked remarkably like a family. But the road ahead would be far from simple. Society had rules, and Margaret Hartley and her son were about to discover just how high the cost of breaking them could be. The transition into her new role was not as smooth as Margaret had hoped. "Mrs. Pemberton made her disapproval clear in 1,000 subtle ways. The slightly worn uniforms provided, the room assignment in the servants' wing rather than near Isabella's nursery, the pointed reminders of proper boundaries between staff and family. The other servants followed the housekeeper's lead, treating Margaret with cool politeness that never quite crossed into warmth. Only Isabella seemed oblivious to the social complexities, greeting Margaret each morning with genuine delight. The child blossomed under Margaret's care, her careful reserve melting away to reveal a bright, curious girl who'd been starved for real attention. They read together, walked in the gardens, talked about everything from flowers to philosophy. Isabella asked endless questions, and Margaret answered them honestly, treating the child's thoughts with respect rather than condescension. Oliver attended their lessons too, an arrangement Nathaniel had approved over Mrs. Pemberton's protests. The two children became inseparable, inventing elaborate games in the garden, sharing secrets, defending each other with fierce loyalty. Margaret watched their friendship with joy and trepidation. She knew how fragile this situation was, how quickly it could all be taken away. Nathaniel visited often, more often than necessary, Margaret thought. He'd arrive during lessons, ostensibly to check on Isabella's progress, but he'd stay to listen to Margaret explain history or mathematics, his intelligent eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her hyper-aware of his presence. Sometimes he'd join their garden walks, and those were the most dangerous times. Walking side by side, discussing literature or philosophy or the education of children, they'd slip into an easy companionship that made Margaret forget, just for moments, the vast gulf between their stations. 2 weeks into her employment, everything changed. It began with a visit from Lady Beatrice Thornhill, a widow in her early 30s who owned the neighbouring estate. She arrived unannounced, dressed in the height of fashion, her smile calculated to charm. "Nathaniel," she called out, sweeping into the drawing room where he was reviewing correspondence. "I heard the most extraordinary rumour and simply had to verify it myself." Nathaniel stood, resigned to whatever social manoeuvring was about to occur. "Beatrice, this is unexpected. Is it true you've taken in some pauper woman and her child, that she's living here at Thornfield?" Beatrice's tone suggested she found the idea both scandalous and amusing. "I've employed a governess for Isabella," Nathaniel corrected coolly. "Mrs. Hartley and her son reside here, yes, as is appropriate for someone in her position. A governess? Really, Nathaniel? Beatrice laughed, settling herself on the sofa without invitation. The woman was found collapsed in the road like some beggar, and now she's living in your home, with your daughter, alone with you. You must see how this looks. How it looks is that I employed someone qualified to care for my child. Qualified? Does she even have references? Beatrice leaned forward conspiratorially. Darling, I know you've been lonely since Victoria passed. We all understand. But bringing some pretty young widow into your home, however desperate her circumstances, will only lead to scandal. People are already talking. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Let them talk. Think of Isabella's future. Think of your own reputation. Beatrice's mask of concern slipped, showing calculation beneath. If you need a governess, I know several respectable women with impeccable credentials. And as for your other needs, well, there are discreet ways to address those that don't involve compromising your daughter's environment. That is quite enough. Nathaniel's voice went cold in a way that made even Beatrice pause. Mrs. Hartley is an exemplary governess. Isabella has flourished under her care in ways she never did with previous staff. My daughter is happy, genuinely happy for the first time since her mother died, and you want me to dismiss that because of gossip? I want you to see reason. This woman is nobody, Nathaniel. She brings nothing to this household except potential scandal. You're a duke. You could have your pick of accomplished, well-bred women who could provide Isabella with proper guidance, and you with a suitable companion. Instead, you're wasting your time on someone so far beneath you that the very association is laughable. Nathaniel moved to the door and opened it. I think you should leave, Beatrice. Nathaniel, now. And in the future, Lady Thornhill, I'd appreciate if you refrained from offering unsolicited advice about how I run my household or raise my daughter. Beatrice stood, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You'll regret this. Mark my words. That woman will bring nothing but trouble. She swept out, leaving a wake of expensive perfume and veiled threats. Nathaniel stood alone in the drawing room, his hands clenched into fists. He knew Beatrice was right about one thing. People were talking, and he knew that Margaret, with her acute sensitivity to propriety, would be devastated when she found out. He was right. Margaret learned about the visit that evening from Sarah, the housemaid, who'd overheard the entire conversation. The girl meant well, thinking Margaret should be warned, but each word fell like a stone into Margaret's stomach. They say you're trapping the Duke, Sarah whispered, as she helped Margaret prepare for bed. That you're using Isabella to worm your way into his good graces. Mrs. Pemberton says it's only a matter of time before the scandal forces him to let you go. After Sarah left, Margaret sat on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, her hands trembling. She'd been so careful, so conscious of maintaining proper boundaries. She never initiated conversations with Nathaniel, never presumed upon his kindness, never forgot for a moment that she was staff and he was master. But it didn't matter. Her very presence was being interpreted as manipulation, and the truly terrifying part? There was truth in the accusations, not about trapping or manipulation. Those were vicious lies. But Margaret couldn't deny, not to herself in the privacy of her small room, that she'd developed feelings for Nathaniel Ashford, feelings that were entirely inappropriate, completely impossible, and growing stronger every day. She loved the way he listened when she spoke, as though her thoughts mattered. She loved his dry humor, his intelligence, the tenderness he showed Isabella when he thought no one was watching. She loved the rare smiles that transformed his austere face into something boyish and warm. She loved the sound of his voice, the way he said her name, the intensity in his eyes when they met hers across the room, and she hated herself for it, because nothing could come of these feelings except pain. She was a governess, a widow, a woman with no money and no prospects. He was a duke, one of the most powerful men in Yorkshire, with a duty to marry well and maintain his family's legacy. The gulf between them wasn't just about class, it was about reality itself. Fairy tales were for children's books, not for women who scrubbed their own laundry and counted every penny. Margaret made her decision that night. She would stay long enough to ensure Isabella was settled with a new governess, then she and Oliver would leave. It was the only way to protect everyone. Isabella from growing too attached, Nathaniel from scandal, Oliver from the inevitable pain when this impossible situation collapsed, and herself from the torture of loving someone she could never have. But the heart, Margaret was learning, didn't follow logical decisions. The next few weeks tested everyone's resolve. Margaret tried to maintain distance, but Isabella clung to her like a lifeline. The child had nightmares and would only calm when Margaret held her. She refused to eat with anyone else present. Her lessons with other tutors became battlegrounds of stubborn resistance. Isabella had found someone who truly saw her, truly loved her, and she wasn't letting go without a fight. Oliver noticed his mother's distress and, in the way of children, blamed himself. "Is it my fault, Mama? Are we leaving because I'm not good enough to be here?" "Never," Margaret told him fiercely, holding him tight. "You are good enough for anywhere, Oliver Hartley. Don't you ever think otherwise." "Then why do you look so sad?" "Because I fell in love with someone I can never have, and it's breaking my heart." But she couldn't say that to her 6-year-old son. "I'm just tired, darling, that's all." Nathaniel saw the change in Margaret, the way she wouldn't meet his eyes anymore, how she found excuses to end conversations quickly, the careful distance she maintained even when they were in the same room. He understood why, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. He found himself growing short-tempered, snapping at servants, neglecting correspondence. His land agent commented that his Grace seemed distracted, and Nathaniel couldn't even argue. He was distracted. Distracted by grey-blue eyes and soft brown hair. Distracted by a laugh he rarely heard anymore. Distracted by the growing realization that Margaret Hartley had become essential to his happiness in a way that terrified him. The crisis came on a rainy afternoon. Of course it did. Rain had brought them together. Perhaps it was fitting that rain would force their hands. Isabella had been fractious all day, sensing the tension between the adults she loved. During their afternoon lesson, she suddenly threw her book across the room. "I don't want to do lessons. I want things to go back to how they were." "Isabella," Margaret said gently, "pick up your book, please." "No, you're going to leave just like Mama did. Everyone leaves." The child's anguish was so raw that Margaret dropped to her knees, pulling Isabella into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not your Mama, and I can never replace her. But I promise you, I love you. That won't change no matter what happens." "Then why are you being so sad? Why won't you smile anymore?" Margaret had no answer. She just held the sobbing child, her own tears falling silently. That's how Nathaniel found them when he came to check on the lesson. Isabella crying in Margaret's arms, Margaret's face etched with grief, both of them breaking apart in slow motion. "Isabella," he said softly, "would you go find Oliver? I need to speak with Miss Maggie." Isabella pulled back, looking between them with solemn, tear-stained eyes. "Are you going to make her leave?" "I'm going to try very hard to make her stay." After Isabella left, closing the door quietly behind her, Nathaniel and Margaret faced each other across the schoolroom. The rain drummed against the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth, and between them hummed all the words they'd been too afraid to say. "You're planning to leave," Nathaniel said. "I have to." Margaret's voice was steady despite her tears. "You must see that. Lady Beatrice was right. My presence here is causing scandal. Isabella is becoming too attached. And I—" She stopped, unable to finish. "And you what, Margaret?" The use of her first name, without any title or formality, broke something in her. "And I'm becoming too attached as well. To Isabella, to this life, to—" She couldn't say it. "To me?" Nathaniel moved closer. "Because I have the same problem, Margaret. I'm attached. Dangerously, inappropriately, completely attached. To your kindness, your strength, the way you've brought warmth back into this cold house, the way you love my daughter, the way you make me want to be a better man, a better father." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "The way you make me feel alive again." "Don't!" Margaret's voice broke. "Please don't say these things. Don't make this harder than it already is." "Why not? Why shouldn't I speak the truth?" "Because the truth doesn't matter. You're a duke, Nathaniel, a duke, and I'm nobody. The daughter of a ruined schoolteacher, the widow of a blacksmith, a governess who can barely read Latin. We live in different worlds and no amount of feeling will change that. So you do feel something." He reached out, gently touching her cheek, wiping away a tear with his thumb. "Say it, Margaret. Just once. Say it out loud. It won't change anything. Say it anyway." Margaret looked up at him, this impossible man who'd somehow captured her heart and surrendered to the truth. "I love you. God help me. I love you. And it's the most foolish, hopeless thing I've ever done." Nathaniel's answer was to cup her face in his hands and kiss her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as though he feared she might vanish like a dream. But when Margaret's hands came up to grip his coat, when she kissed him back with all the longing she'd been suppressing, gentleness gave way to passion. Years of loneliness, weeks of tension, days of denial, all of it poured into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, Both breathless, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "Don't leave, please. I can't bear the thought of losing you. Society will never accept this. Lady Beatrice—" "Damn Lady Beatrice. Damn society." Nathaniel pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I've spent 5 years living according to everyone else's expectations, being the proper duke, the dutiful father, the appropriate widower, and I've been miserable, isolated, half alive. Then you came into my life, you and Oliver, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to be human, to laugh, to hope, to love." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I love you, Margaret Hartley. I love your courage and your pride and the way you love your son. I love the woman who'd rather die than accept charity, who works until she collapses rather than admit she needs help. I love how you've helped me reconnect with my daughter, how you've shown me what family should feel like, and I want this, all of this, forever." "You're talking about marriage." Margaret could barely breathe. "You can't marry me. The scandal alone will be considerable, yes. Some people will cut ties. Others will gossip. Society will be shocked." Nathaniel smiled, and it was the freest smile Margaret had ever seen on his face. "And I find that I don't care nearly as much as I should. My daughter is happy. I'm happy. For the first time in years, this house feels like a home rather than a mausoleum. That's worth more than a dozen scandals. What about Isabella's future? If you marry beneath your station—" "I'm marrying the woman I love, who also happens to be the best thing that's ever happened to my daughter. Isabella adores you. Oliver is already like a son to me. We're a family in everything but name. Let's make it official." Margaret wanted to say yes. Every fiber of her being screamed to accept, to take this impossible gift and hold on to it with both hands. But years of struggle, of knowing her place, of understanding how the world worked, made her hesitate. "I need time," she whispered. It's too much, too fast. I need to think." Nathaniel nodded, though disappointment flickered across his face. "Take all the time you need, but Margaret, don't let fear make your decision. Don't let society's rules dictate your happiness. We get one life. Choose yours deliberately." He left her there in the schoolroom, with her thoughts in chaos and her heart in turmoil. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Whitmore arrived, requesting to see Nathaniel, his expression grave. They met in the study, and the doctor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been making inquiries, Nathaniel, at your request, about Mrs. Hartley's previous circumstances." Nathaniel had asked Whitmore to investigate quietly, wanting to understand more about the woman who'd captured his heart. "And? Margaret is indeed the daughter of Richard Hartley, a schoolmaster of some reputation. He educated her himself, Latin, Greek, literature, mathematics, all of it. She was engaged to a young man of good family. But when her father died, and it was discovered he'd been swindled by a business partner, the engagement was broken. The young man's family wanted nothing to do with a pauper. Margaret was left with nothing." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Go on." "She married Thomas Hartley, a blacksmith, a good man by all accounts, but poor. They were happy, from what I can gather. Then 2 years ago, Thomas was killed when the roof of the smithy collapsed during a storm. No compensation, no pension, nothing. Margaret was left alone with a young child and no means of support. She's been working herself to death ever since, too proud to ask for help, trying to give Oliver the education her father gave her despite having nothing." Whitmore paused, then added quietly, "Nathaniel, that woman has more dignity and strength of character than most of the nobility I've met. What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to marry her," Nathaniel said simply, "if she'll have me. Society will be merciless. Society has been comfortably merciless for far too long. Perhaps it's time someone with actual power pushed back." Whitmore smiled. "Good man, Victoria would be proud." The mention of his late wife gave Nathaniel pause. "Do you think, would Victoria approve? Of you finding happiness again? Of Isabella having a mother who genuinely loves her? Of you choosing love over duty?" Whitmore placed a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "Nathaniel, Victoria's last words to me were to make sure you didn't let grief destroy you. She wanted you to live, to love again, to be happy. I think she'd take one look at Margaret and say, 'About time you found someone worthy of you.'" The words settled something in Nathaniel's chest. He wasn't betraying Victoria's memory. He was honoring her wish that he live fully. He found Margaret in the garden watching Oliver and Isabella play. She looked tired, as though she hadn't slept any better than he had. "I spoke with Dr. Whitmore," Nathaniel said, coming to stand beside her. "He told me about your father, about your education, about the fiancé who abandoned you when your circumstances changed." Margaret's cheeks flushed. You investigated me? I wanted to understand, but Margaret, you told me you weren't qualified to be a governess. You have more education than most men I know. Education without money or connections is worthless. I learned that the hard way. That man who left you, he was a fool. He was practical. His family needed him to marry well. I couldn't give him that. Margaret's voice was matter of fact, but Nathaniel heard the old hurt beneath it. Then he didn't deserve you. Nathaniel took her hand, not caring that servants might see. Margaret, you've been hurt by people who judged you based on circumstances rather than character, people who valued money and status over integrity and love. I'm asking you not to do the same thing now. What do you mean? Don't reject me because I'm a duke. Don't assume I'm making this decision lightly or out of pity or temporary infatuation. I know my own mind. I know my own heart. And both are entirely certain that you are the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. Margaret looked at him, this powerful man who was offering her everything she'd thought impossible. If I say yes, people will say I trapped you. They'll say I used Isabella to manipulate you. They'll call me a fortune hunter, an opportunist. Every cruel thing they can think of, probably. Will you let them? It won't just affect me, it will affect Oliver. People will treat him differently, judge him, make his life difficult. Or, Nathaniel countered, they'll see him as my son, the son of a duke, with all the advantages and opportunities that entails, education at the finest schools, university, a future that isn't limited by the circumstances of his birth. Isn't that what you've been working yourself to death trying to give him? Margaret's breath caught. She'd been so focused on the negatives that she hadn't considered what this could mean for Oliver. A real education, protection, opportunity, everything she dreamed of giving him but knew she never could on her own. And Isabella? She asked softly. Will finally have what she's been missing, a mother who loves her for who she is, not what she represents. Margaret, look at them. They both turned to watch the children. Oliver and Isabella had built an elaborate fortress out of fallen branches and were defending it against imaginary invaders, their laughter ringing across the garden. They moved together with the easy synchronization of siblings, each anticipating the other's actions, united in their play. They're already family, Nathaniel said. We're just catching up to them. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. I'm terrified. So am I. Nathaniel smiled. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safely miserable without you. What if I make things worse? What if society's censure hurts Isabella's prospects, makes Oliver's life harder, damages your position? Margaret, Nathaniel turned her to face him fully. What if it works? What if we build something beautiful? What if our children, all our children, grow up in a home filled with love instead of cold propriety? What if we show society that people matter more than bloodlines? He cupped her face gently. What if we're happy? Margaret looked into his eyes and saw not a duke but a man who'd been lonely, a man who'd suffered loss, a man who was choosing, against all logic and social convention, to love her. And she knew that she could spend the rest of her life protecting herself from potential pain, or she could take this extraordinary chance at happiness. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Nathaniel's smile was incandescent. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a man who'd just been freed from prison. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, not caring that they were in full view of the house. Papa? Miss Maggie? They broke apart to find Isabella and Oliver standing a few feet away, staring at them with wide eyes. Are you getting married? Isabella asked, her voice trembling with hope. Yes, Nathaniel said, reaching out to his daughter. If that's all right with you. Isabella launched herself at both of them, sobbing with happiness. I've been wishing for this every night. I wanted Miss Maggie to be my real mamma so badly. Oliver, more reserved, looked up at Nathaniel. Does this mean you'll be my papa? Nathaniel knelt down to Oliver's level. If you'll have me, I promise I'll do my best to be worthy of it. Oliver studied him seriously for a moment, then nodded. You're kind, and you make Mama smile. That's good enough for me. He paused, then added shyly, Papa. Nathaniel pulled both children into his arms, and Margaret joined them, and for a long moment the four of them just held each other in the garden, a family united not by blood or convention, but by choice and love. Mrs. Pemberton, watching from a window, shook her head but couldn't quite suppress a small smile. Perhaps the Duke had gone mad, or perhaps, and this was the more frightening thought, perhaps he'd finally become wise. The announcement of the engagement caused exactly the scandal Margaret had feared. Lady Beatrice led the charge, spreading gossip about opportunistic governesses and bewitched dukes throughout Yorkshire society. Several families of rank sent frosty letters expressing their concern for Nathaniel's judgment. Some cut social ties entirely, but there were surprises too. Dr. Whitmore publicly defended Margaret's character at the Gentlemen's Club, shaming those who dare to judge without knowing her. The vicar, who'd met Margaret and Oliver at church, spoke warmly of her devotion and grace. Several of the village women who'd worked alongside Margaret during her desperate days came forward with stories of her kindness and strength, and slowly, public opinion began to shift. Not completely. There would always be those who considered the match scandalous. But enough people saw the genuine love between Nathaniel and Margaret, saw how Isabella flourished, saw the Duke's happiness, that opposition began to soften. The wedding was planned for December, in the small chapel on the Thornfield estate. Margaret wanted something simple, but Nathaniel insisted she deserved better than that. "You've spent your entire life making do with less, settling for simple because you had no choice," he told her. "Let me give you something beautiful. Not to show off, but because you deserve to feel special, cherished, celebrated." They compromised. The wedding would be in the chapel, intimate rather than grand, but Margaret would have a proper wedding dress, flowers, music, everything a bride should have. The weeks before the wedding were both joyful and challenging. Margaret worked with Mrs. Pemberton, who'd grudgingly accepted the inevitable, to prepare for her new role as Duchess. There were lessons in household management, social protocols, the complex web of relationships that defined aristocratic life. It was overwhelming, but Margaret threw herself into learning with the same determination she'd shown in everything else. Oliver began lessons with a proper tutor, alongside Isabella. Watching her son receive the education she'd always dreamed of giving him filled Margaret with fierce joy. He was so bright, so eager to learn. In a few years he'd go to proper schools, maybe even university. The poverty that had defined his early years would be nothing but a distant memory. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked Nathaniel one evening as they sat in the library. "About Oliver's education, the opportunities you're offering. That's a significant investment. He's going to be my son, Margaret. Did you think I'd do any less for him than I would for any child of mine?" Nathaniel took her hand. "Besides, I like the boy. He's clever, kind, and he adores you. Those are excellent qualities in a son." The genuine affection in his voice made Margaret's eyes sting with tears. "Thank you for seeing him, for caring about him. I know he's not yours by blood. Neither is Isabella mine by blood connection to you, yet you love her fiercely. Family isn't about blood, Margaret. It's about choice. I choose Oliver. I choose you. I choose this life we're building together." On a cold December morning, with snow beginning to fall, Margaret Hartley became the Duchess of Ravenswood. She stood in the vestibule of the chapel, wearing a gown of cream silk that Nathaniel had commissioned from London's finest dressmaker. It was simple compared to many aristocratic wedding gowns, but to Margaret, who'd spent years in patched cotton, it felt like wearing a cloud. Her hair was dressed with small white flowers, and she carried a bouquet of winter roses from Thornfield's greenhouse. Oliver, in his new suit, stood beside her as her man of honor. He looked so grown up, so proud, that Margaret had to fight back tears. "You look beautiful, Mama," he whispered. "I'm so nervous," she admitted. "Don't be. Papa loves you. Everyone can see it." Oliver said it so naturally, "Papa," that Margaret's heart swelled. The chapel doors opened, and Margaret saw the small gathering of guests. Dr. Whitmore beaming, the vicar, a few of Nathaniel's closest friends who'd stood by him despite the scandal, the household staff who'd been given the afternoon off to attend, and at the front, standing beside the altar with Isabella at his side, was Nathaniel. He looked magnificent in his formal attire, but it was the expression on his face when he saw Margaret that made her breath catch. Pure love, pure joy, pure certainty. All her fears about whether this was right, whether she belonged here, whether she was making a terrible mistake, all of it evaporated in the face of that look. She walked down the aisle on Oliver's small arm, her son giving her away with all the solemnity a 6-year-old could muster. When they reached the altar, Oliver placed Margaret's hand in Nathaniel's, then went to stand with Isabella. The two children held hands, watching with shining eyes as their parents married. The vows were traditional, but when Nathaniel spoke them, they felt like a promise written just for her. "I, Nathaniel Edmund Ashford, take thee, Margaret Ann Hartley, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Margaret's voice trembled as she repeated the words back to him, but she meant every syllable. This man had saved her life, given her son a future, loved her despite all the reasons he shouldn't. She would spend the rest of her days being worthy of that gift. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of such moments. The small gathering applauded. Isabella and Oliver cheered. And Margaret Hartley, now Margaret Ashford, Duchess of Ravenswood, felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Complete, uncomplicated joy. The reception was held at Thornfield Manor, small but elegant. There was music, dancing, food and laughter. Margaret danced with her new husband, with Oliver, even with Dr. Whitmore, who told her, "You've given that man back his life. Thank you." Late in the evening, as snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled in the great hall, Nathaniel pulled Margaret aside. "Happy?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "But yes, happy. Deliriously happy." "Good, because I have something for you." He led her to his study and presented her with a document. "The deed to your old cottage and the surrounding 5 acres. I've purchased it. It's yours now, legally, completely yours. No landlord can ever threaten to take it away." Margaret stared at the document, overwhelmed. "But why?" "Because you need to know you're not trapped, that you're not dependent on my goodwill or anyone else's. That cottage represents your independence, your ability to survive on your own. I never want you to feel like you have to stay with me out of necessity. I want you to stay because you choose to, every single day." Margaret looked up at him, this extraordinary man who understood her so completely. "So you're giving me an escape route. I'm giving you freedom, the knowledge that you have options always. That's what you fought for your whole life, isn't it? The right to choose your own path." He smiled. "I'm just hoping your path keeps choosing me." Margaret set down the deed and wrapped her arms around him. "You foolish, wonderful man. Don't you know by now? My path is you. Wherever you go, I go. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what family means." "I thought family was about blood." "No," Margaret said softly. "Family is about showing up, about choosing each other every day, about love that persists despite difficulty. We're a family, Nathaniel, the 4 of us, and nothing, not society, not scandal, not the whole world, can take that away." He kissed her then, and it felt like a promise, a prayer, and a celebration all at once. Upstairs, Isabella and Oliver sat together in the nursery window seat, watching the snow fall. "Do you think they're happy?" Oliver asked. "I think they're perfect," Isabella said firmly. "Like we're perfect. We're a real family now." "We were always a real family," Oliver corrected gently. "We just made it official." Isabella considered this, then nodded. "You're right. And you know what? I'm glad Miss Maggie collapsed in the rain that day." "Isabella?" Oliver looked shocked. "That's a terrible thing to say." "No, I mean—" Isabella struggled to express her thought. "If she hadn't collapsed, if you hadn't been brave enough to ask for help, none of this would have happened. Sometimes bad things have to happen, so good things can follow. Does that make sense?" Oliver thought about it, then slowly smiled. "Like Papa says, we get to choose what we do with the things that happen to us. Mama chose to keep going. You chose to be my friend. Papa chose to help us. And all those choices led to this, to us being a family. Yeah, to us being a family." They sat together in comfortable silence, 2 children who'd found in each other the sibling each had always wanted, watching the snow transform the world into something clean and new and full of possibility. Downstairs, the celebration continued. Music played, people laughed, and in the corner Nathaniel and Margaret danced together, talking quietly, their heads close together, lost in their own world. Mrs. Pemberton, supervising the servants with her usual efficiency, paused to watch them. She'd been wrong. She could admit that now. This wasn't a scandal or a mistake. This was a second chance for the Duke, for his daughter, for that brave boy and his remarkable mother. This was what happened when people chose courage over convention, love over propriety. It was extraordinary, it was unconventional, it was perfect. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the grounds of Thornfield Manor in white. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges, new joys, new chapters in the story of this unlikely family. But for now, in the warm glow of firelight and love, that was a story for another day. Tonight was for celebrating the family that rain and courage had brought together, the family that love and choice had made permanent, the family that would face whatever came next, together. 5 years passed like pages turning in a beloved book. some chapters peaceful, others challenging, all of them precious. It was a crisp autumn morning in 1892 when Margaret stood on the terrace of Thornfield Manor, watching her family gather in the garden below. So much had changed, yet the essence of what they'd built remained constant. Oliver, now 11, sat under the old oak tree with a book of advanced mathematics, occasionally explaining concepts to Isabella, who at 10 had developed her father's love of learning. They'd grown from playmates into genuine siblings, their bond deepening with each passing year. Oliver had just been accepted to Eton, a prestigious boarding school that would have been unthinkable in his previous life. He was nervous about leaving home, but excited too, and Margaret had learned to let him grow, to trust that the foundation they'd built was strong enough to support him wherever he went. Isabella had blossomed into a confident, compassionate child who treated servants and nobility with equal respect, a trait that occasionally raised eyebrows in society, but made her parents enormously proud. She volunteered with Margaret at the charity school they'd established in the village, teaching reading to children whose families couldn't afford education. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The governess, who'd been considered barely qualified, now oversaw an entire educational program. A squeal of laughter drew Margaret's attention to the lawn where 3-year-old Thomas was chasing butterflies with the single-minded determination of toddlerhood. He had Nathaniel's dark hair and Margaret's grey-blue eyes, and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone he met. Following at a more sedate pace was 1-year-old Victoria, just learning to walk, her small hand clutched in her father's as they explored the garden together. Nathaniel. Margaret's heart still fluttered when she looked at him, even after 5 years of marriage. He'd aged slightly, a few more silver threads in his hair, lines around his eyes from laughter. But the change suited him. He looked happy, truly happy, in a way that the cold Duke of 5 years ago never had. Their marriage had weathered storms. The scandal had been real. Several families had indeed cut social ties, and there were still those in society who considered Margaret an interloper. But Nathaniel's position and Margaret's undeniable grace had won over most reasonable people. More importantly, they'd created a home filled with genuine warmth, and that authenticity had proven more powerful than any gossip. Margaret had thrown herself into charity work, using her position to help women in circumstances similar to her own previous situation. She'd established a fund for widows, a program to train young women in useful trades, and the charity school that was her particular pride. Some called her radical for caring so much about the lower classes. Margaret considered it remembering where she came from. "Mama!" Thomas ran up the terrace steps, his small face flushed with excitement. "I caught a butterfly, well, not really caught it, but I touched its wing. It was blue and very fast." Margaret scooped him up, kissing his sweaty forehead. "How wonderful, darling. You'll have to tell me all about it at lunch. Can we have the chocolate cake Mrs. Pemberton made?" "We'll see," Margaret smiled. Mrs. Pemberton had become an unexpected ally over the years. Once she'd accepted that Margaret was there to stay, the older woman had begun to respect, even admire, the young Duchess. They'd never be warm friends, but there was genuine mutual respect now. Nathaniel climbed the terrace steps, Victoria toddling beside him. "Someone is getting tired," he reported. "I think it's nap time." "I think Papa is right," Margaret said, reaching for their daughter. Victoria came to her willingly, laying her dark head on Margaret's shoulder with a content sigh. Nathaniel watched them for a moment, his expression soft. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "5 years ago, that terrible night in the rain?" "Every day," Margaret admitted. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. Do you have regrets?" "Never." Margaret reached out with her free hand to touch his face. "Do you?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner." Nathaniel caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You've given me everything, Margaret. A real family, a home that feels alive, purpose beyond duty, joy beyond measure." "We gave those things to each other," Margaret corrected. "You saved my life that night, Nathaniel, not just physically, though certainly that too, but you gave Oliver and me a future. You gave us hope. You gave us love when we'd forgotten what that felt like." "Mama, Papa, you're being mushy again," Isabella called from the garden, giggling. "Can't help it," Nathaniel called back. "Your mother is very beautiful and I'm very fortunate." "Papa!" Isabella covered her face, embarrassed and delighted in equal measure. Oliver looked up from his book and grinned. "You two are disgusting," he announced, but his tone was affectionate. He'd grown comfortable calling Nathaniel Papa years ago, and the title came as naturally now as if they'd always been father and son. "Disgusting and happy," Nathaniel agreed cheerfully. He turned back to Margaret, lowering his voice. I received a letter from Lady Beatrice today. Oh? Margaret kept her tone neutral. Beatrice had been their most vocal critic in the early days. She's requesting advice. She wants to start a program for orphaned children on her estate and asked if you'd consult with her. Nathaniel's eyes twinkled. I believe the exact phrase was the Duchess of Ravenswood's remarkable work with the less fortunate. Margaret laughed in surprise. Beatrice? Really? People change. Or perhaps they finally see what was in front of them all along. Nathaniel pulled her close as he could with Victoria between them. You've changed minds, Margaret. Not through scandal or manipulation, but through genuine goodness. You've shown society that value isn't determined by birth, that love matters more than bloodlines, that people deserve chances regardless of their circumstances. We've shown them, Margaret corrected. You're the one who had the courage to defy convention in the first place, because you were worth defying convention for. They stood together on the terrace, their sleeping daughter between them, watching their other children play in the garden. Thomas had rejoined Oliver and Isabella, and all three were now building something elaborate with sticks and stones. The autumn sun slanted through the trees, painting everything gold. Do you ever think about that night? Margaret asked softly. About how close we came to never having this? Every single day, Nathaniel admitted. If Oliver hadn't been brave enough to ask for help, if I'd turned him away, if you hadn't survived. His arms tightened around her. We were so close to losing everything we didn't even know we could have. But we didn't lose it, we found it. Margaret leaned into him. Sometimes I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, exhausted, desperate, convinced that pride was all I had left. If I could go back and tell her what was coming, would you? Margaret considered. No, because part of what makes this precious is that we didn't know. We took chances without knowing the outcome. You opened your door to a terrified child. I accepted employment despite my fears. We chose each other despite every logical reason not to. If we'd known it would work out, that wouldn't have been courage. It would have been certainty. You're very wise, Duchess Ravenswood. I've had an excellent teacher. Margaret smiled up at him. You've taught me that it's okay to accept help. That pride can be a prison. That family isn't about blood or status, but about showing up every day and choosing each other again and again. And you've taught me how to live again, how to feel again, how to be a real father instead of just a distant guardian. Nathaniel looked at their children in the garden. Isabella is thriving. Oliver is brilliant and kind. Thomas and Victoria will grow up knowing they're loved, not just provided for. That's all you, Margaret. It's us, she insisted. Everything we've built together. Dr. Whitmore's carriage came up the drive. He visited often now, having become almost a grandfather figure to the children. He climbed down and headed straight for the garden, where he was immediately mobbed by enthusiastic young people demanding to show him their latest projects. He's good with them, Nathaniel observed. He's family, Margaret said simply. Not by blood, but by choice, like all the best family is. That evening, after the children were in bed, Nathaniel and Margaret walked through the gardens together, a nightly ritual when weather permitted. The air was crisp and smelled of autumn leaves and coming rain. Storm's coming, Nathaniel noted, looking at the darkening sky. Margaret squeezed his hand. I used to be terrified of rain. Now, she paused, thinking, now I'm grateful for it. Rain brought us together. Rain gave us this life. Poetic, Nathaniel teased gently. True, Margaret countered. She stopped walking and turned to face him. Nathaniel, I want you to know something. If I had to do it all over again, the poverty, the struggle, the night I collapsed in the rain, all of it, I would, without hesitation, because it led me here, to you, to this family we've built. Every hardship was worth it. Margaret, let me finish. She took both his hands. You told me once to choose my life deliberately. I have. Every day I choose this. I choose you. I choose our children. I choose the life we've made together, with all its challenges and joys. You gave me the freedom to choose, and I choose you, always. Nathaniel pulled her close and kissed her, and it felt like the first kiss and the 1,000th all at once. Familiar and thrilling, comfortable and exciting, everything a kiss should be after 5 years of marriage. I choose you too, he whispered against her lips. Today and every day, forever. The rain began to fall then, gentle at first, then harder. Instead of running for shelter, they stood in it, laughing, holding each other, remembering a night 5 years ago when rain had changed everything. We should go in, Margaret said eventually, but she didn't move. Probably, Nathaniel agreed. Not moving either. The children will see us and think we've gone mad. Let them, we're allowed to be a little mad. They finally went inside. soaked through and still laughing. Mrs. Pemberton appeared with towels and a disapproving look that couldn't quite hide her amusement. "Really, Your Grace," she said, addressing them both. "What kind of example are you setting for the children?" "A good one, I hope," Margaret said, accepting a towel. "Teaching them that joy matters more than dignity, that love is worth getting a little wet for." Mrs. Pemberton shook her head but smiled. "You're impossible, both of you." "Impossibly happy," Nathaniel corrected, wrapping an arm around Margaret's waist. Later, in their private sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth and warm tea chasing away the rain's chill, Margaret and Nathaniel sat together on the sofa. Margaret's head rested on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them simply existing in comfortable companionship. "Do you think they'll tell our story one day?" Margaret asked idly. "The Duke who married his governess? Probably. Society loves a scandal. It's not a scandal anymore, though, is it? It's just our life." "A very good life," Nathaniel agreed. He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you, Margaret, for saying yes, for taking a chance on me, for building this beautiful life with me. Thank you for not letting me leave that day, for fighting for us when I was too scared to fight for myself." Margaret lifted her head to look at him. "Thank you for seeing me, not the governess or the widow or the poor woman who needed saving, but me, Margaret, the person beneath all those labels. Always," Nathaniel promised, "I will always see you." The rain continued through the night, but inside Thornfield Manor, all was warm and safe and full of love. In the nursery, Victoria slept peacefully, watched over by a devoted nurse. In their shared room, Oliver and Thomas were already asleep, one dreaming of Eton, the other of butterflies. In her own room, Isabella lay awake for a little while, writing in her journal about the wonderful, unconventional family she was so grateful to be part of. And in their sitting room, a duke and his duchess sat together, watching the fire, holding each other close, knowing they'd found something rare and precious, a love built on courage, sustained by choice, and strengthened by every challenge they'd faced together. 5 years ago, a desperate woman had collapsed in the rain. Her terrified son had run to a duke's mansion for help, and from that one act of courage, from that one moment of compassion, an entire world had been born. A world where family was defined by love rather than blood, where second chances were possible, where courage was rewarded, where happy endings weren't just for fairy tales. A world where Margaret Hartley, now Margaret Ashford, Duchess of Ravenswood, looked at her husband and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home. The end.